Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well and keeping your chin up during this awkward and weird time. I have the last main lecture video for this semester to do here. It's on Aristotle's virtue ethics. So although I may do a little wrap-up video as a final lecture to the course to kind of put a capstone on it, this is the last of the main material for the chapters for chapter 7 and for the class. So let's get into it here. We've been looking at normative ethical theory or prescriptive moral theories in this chapter. So far, we've looked at utilitarianism. The basic idea in utilitarianism is the utility or the greatest happiness principle, which says I ought to act either perform the actions that will maximize overall happiness for the most number of people, or if it's rule utilitarianism, follow the social policies or the moral rules that would, if everyone followed them, maximize overall happiness. We've also looked at Kantian ethics, so that was kind of two different versions of that, deontology and respect for persons ethics. Both of those are rooted in the categorical imperative, which says that there are obligations binding on rational agents regardless of our personal aims or interests or inclinations. And so I ought to either perform those actions that are based on maxims that can be willed as a universal law without contradiction, or to only perform those actions that respect individuals and respect autonomy or respect rational personhood and never treat rational agents as mere means. So both of those approaches to normative ethical theories were action-based theories. They're theories that aim to identify a normative standard for answering the question, what ought I do, right? This last normative ethical theory that we're going to look at, virtue ethics, and when I talk about virtue ethics here in this lecture, I just mean Aristotle's version of virtue ethics. There are others, but Aristotle gives us the kind of classical version of it, one of the main versions of it, one of the more influential versions of it. But it's a character-based theory. In other words, rather than providing a normative criteria to answer the question, what ought I do, it tries to answer the question, what kind of person should I be, or how ought I live, which is a much broader question than just what ought I do. So it's focused not on identifying the actions that we ought to perform, but focused on identifying the character traits or virtues that we ought to develop, as opposed to those that are negative character traits, vices. So let's take a look at Aristotle's virtue ethics here. So if you've seen, I think most of you are probably familiar with South Park, and have maybe seen this episode, The List of South Park, where all the girls in South Park Elementary School, they make a list of the boys in order of attractiveness. Right? And Kyle he's the very last. He's ranked last. Cartman is ranked above Kyle. Butters is ranked number 11. He's very happy about that. Makes a T-shirt that says number 11 on it. When his parents find out that he was ranked number 11, they decide not to ground Butters, which seems like a strange reason to ground to refrain from grounding a kid, or a weird reason to ground a child. Probably explains a little bit about Butters there. And Kyle was ranked last, and he's very upset by this, of course. The other kids, especially Cartman, try to rub it into him that he was ranked last. Of course, I don't want to spoil the episode if you haven't seen it, but it comes to light that there's a problem with this list, right? But anyway, while he's depressed about being ranked last, South Park does the kind of Ghost of Christmas Past kind of thing with Abraham Lincoln. He comes to visit Kyle. Abraham Lincoln wrote about the virtues and is often reported to have been a very virtuous person, actually. And he comes to try to teach Kyle that what's important in life is not how you're ranked in terms of attractiveness, but what you make of yourself, what you make of your character. And that's the basic idea of a virtue ethics. And so again, our version of this comes from Aristotle. The Stoics, virtue ethics was really the main approach to ethics in ancient philosophy, and really up through a lot of the pre-modern medieval period even. And then it gets kind of, at least in terms of philosophy, deontology and utilitarianism become the main schools of two main approaches to moral philosophy in the modern era. era, and virtue ethics is kind of left out, although it's made a comeback over the last, since 1950s or 1960s, really. I forget the year that Anscombe's famous essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, was published, but it kind of brings about a revival of virtue ethics among philosophers in the latter half of the 20th century and 21st centuries. And so contemporary versions of virtue ethics often take their point of departure from Aristotle. And so let's take a look at his classic version of this theory as it's presented in the Nicomachean Ethics. So we got some basic ideas to worry about here. The function argument is central to Aristotle's view here. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The idea of a virtue as opposed to a vice. And then the golden mean is going to be our basic normative or prescriptive standard according to this theory. And then the idea of eudaimonia, which usually gets translated as happiness, but means something more like well-being or human flourishing, as Aristotle uses the term. So first, let's take a look at the function argument. Aristotle has a teleological view of everything, including human nature. Everything in nature is teleologically oriented. In other words, it's attempting to realize a goal or based on a goal, right? So we've looked at utilitarianism previously. It was also a teleological theory. But in utilitarianism, human beings didn't have a natural telos in the way Aristotle thinks. It was still a teleological theory in the sense that it based right conduct on whether or not that conduct maximized overall happiness. But Mill had a liberal individualist conception of the human person. Aristotle does not. And so he thinks that human nature has a function and a telos that's based on the kind of thing that we are, right? That defines the kind of thing that we are. And people new to Aristotle, when they're looking at Aristotle for the first time, like many of y'all are, you might have this idea in mind that, oh, the function of human nature is whatever I choose to do with myself. But that's not what Aristotle has in mind here. He thinks that we have a natural function given the sorts of beings that we are, not that we're each picking our own function, right? So it's not like Chris Blakely has a unique function. It's that all of us have the same function in virtue of being rational human beings, right? Or animals with reason, as Aristotle would put it. So let's take a look at this function argument. This is his view of human nature that serves as a basis for his moral philosophy. So he says, the function of man is to live a certain kind of life, and this activity implies a rational principle. And the function of a good man is the good and noble performance of these. And if any action is well performed, it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence. If this is the case, then happiness turns out to be an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Notice that's a different notion of happiness than we saw in utilitarianism as well, where happiness was just pleasure. This is happiness understood to be in terms of the excellence of a function. So moral goodness for Aristotle, as he indicates here, is rooted in the performance of a function with excellence, as opposed to poorly performing the function. So a good hammer is a tool that hammers well, and a good human being is an individual that performs the function of being human with excellence. Very different notion of happiness then. It's not just, happiness isn't just waking up and being in a good mood or pleasure, it's performance of this function. So he says, happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Happiness is desirable in itself, never for the sake of something else. So happiness or eudaimonia is intrinsically good or intrinsically valuable, according to Aristotle. But honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we choose indeed for themselves, but we also choose them for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we shall be happy. So already we get this notion here that in order to be a happy individual, we have to cultivate the virtues. So happiness, on the one hand, no one chooses for the sake of these, nor in general for anything other than itself. Happiness then is something final and sufficient. So again, we kind of have a teleological structure in Aristotle. On the one hand, we have human nature that's untutored, undisciplined as it comes into the world, right? You're just a bundle of drives and capacities. And then human nature as it would be if it realized or perfected itself, right? And so that's the teleological structure here. In order to get from untutored, untrained, undisciplined human nature as it is just brand new coming into the world as a bundle of drives, we have human nature as it would be if it realized its potential. And in order to get from here to the telos, we need to cultivate the virtues and avoid the vices. So how are we going to acquire these virtues? It's through practice, right? Habit formation. So virtue then is twofold, partly intellectual and partly moral. And intellectual virtue is originated and fostered mainly by teaching. Moral virtue is the outcome of habit, and accordingly, its name ithke is derived from a slight variation of ethos or habit. From this fact, it's clear that moral virtue is not implanted in us by nature. So the idea here is that we develop habits, and we need to develop the right sorts of habits. And we do that through recognizing opportunities to practice those habits, right? And thereby developing them, kind of making them a second nature so that we're doing them more deliberately, right? So he says, it is moral virtue that is concerned with emotions and actions, and that in these we have both excess and deficiency in the mean. Thus it is possible to go too far or not enough. And the excess and the deficiency are alike wrong, but to feel emotions at the right times and for the right objects, towards the right persons, for the right motives, and in the right manner, is the mean or best good, which signifies virtue. Similarly, there may be excess, deficiency, or the mean, wherein excess and deficiency is all error and deficiency fault, while the mean is successful and praised, and these are characteristics of virtue. So we can get a kind of deficiency, mean, excess chart here, in which the virtues are in the middle, the mean, and the excesses or deficiencies are on the peripheries. So courage then is a mean between cowardice, running when the first shot's fired, and recklessness, running foolhardily into battle. So it's a response to fear, right? It's being able to maintain one's reason and presence of mind in the face of fear. And then so we have a list of virtues here, more than the 4 cardinal virtues. So the 4 cardinal virtues are justice, temperance, wisdom, and what did I say? Courage, wisdom, temperance, and justice, right? Those are the 4 cardinal virtues. Aristotle expands that list. So here we have courage, honesty, generosity, modesty, self-discipline, gentleness, and wit. And the virtues are means between those extremes. So take a second here and look at this chart and notice how I have it set up to where we have the deficiency or lacking the trait on one hand, excess on the other, and mean in the middle. And then let's take a look at an example of a virtue. Aristotle thought in order to be an ideally moral person, right? So another way of thinking about what Aristotle was up to here is to think of, well, what would the ideal moral person be like, and what are all the traits that they would have to have in order to be a moral ideal? And then I need to go about trying to cultivating those traits, right? So Aristotle thought that in order to be an ideally moral agent, you'd have to have a sense of humor, right? So let's do a little example here. On the one hand, we have someone like Michael Scott. I'm drawing this out of you can do this with the British version or the American version of The Office. And I'm drawing it out of an article that's mentioned in the notes here to my notes, where an author uses Aristotle to analyze The Office. And so we have Michael Scott on the one hand. He's what Aristotle calls the buffoon. He's a slave to his own sense of humor. Often the joke is on Michael because he lacks self-awareness, he's lacking a virtue there. And so the things he says often make him look ridiculous or silly or unaware of his own self. And so Aristotle describes this as a slave, a person that's a slave to his own sense of humor. So Michael Scott often disrupts the workplace with his sense of humor. And it's often distracting and a waste of time, right? On the other hand, we have somebody that's a bore, someone that sucks the fun out of the room, can't take a joke, can't put up with those who do take jokes, or who do make jokes, right? So it's the bore. Dwight's more along that line. But in the middle, we have somebody more like Jim. And Aristotle remarks that those who joke in a tasteful way are called ready-witted, which implies a sort of readiness to turn this way or that, for such the sallies of thought to be the movement of character. Well, Jim, he plays pranks on Dwight, but when they hurt Dwight's feelings, he feels bad for him. Most of his pranks are not done with malice, right? Anyway, so you have Jim that's closer to the virtue of wit there. So we talked about the different standards for moral theories, right? And and how they guide action or guide character traits. Well, here we have this idea that everyone ought to act. Notice the universal nature. Everyone, right, ought to act in ways that promote the flourishing of human beings, the realizing of our human nature. Right. So Aristotle thought that man was the animal with reason. That's what defines human nature. And so reason, in this case, prudence, is a matter of picking out the mean and then habituating that mean so that we can become happy individuals. So if we don't cultivate some virtues, we won't be happy, according to Aristotle. In order to do that, we need friends, right? So Aristotle famously identified 3 types of friendship. And he says, wishing to be friends is quick work, but friendship is a slow ripening fruit. So in order to have a society, you have to have relationships of utility. Those are on the bottom. I have them in the #1 spot here, but really those are the lowest form of friendships. I want a mechanic. I can't fix cars. I need a mechanic to fix my car. I want a mechanic that's not only technically capable of fixing cars, but also an honest one, right? It's not going to say that something's damaged when it's not, or sell me things that I don't really need. But that's a friendship of utility, right? You move into the dorm, you don't have a car, you need to make friends with someone with a car so that you can get to the airport or the bus station or to go take you to the grocery store, right? Friendships of utility. You couldn't have a society without friendships of utility. And then we have friendships of pleasure. These are friendships or relationships that we have with others because we both find some other activity pleasurable, right? So like friends that you have through your intramural sports teams or something like that, or extracurricular activities, people that you have friendships with based on the fact that you're both participating in this activity. Then we have friendships of the good. This is what we would call our best friends, right? And these are friendships that are oriented around the mutual pursuit of excellence, right? And the development of our character around each other. So, you know, your parents probably had this idea that they were worried about what kind of company you keep during your formative years because they don't want you to develop bad habits, right? It's a very Aristotelian way of looking at that. So those who wish good things to their friends for the sake of the latter are friends most of all because they do so for their friends themselves and not coincidentally, right? So again, these are your friends that are concerned, that have your well-being first and foremost in their minds as well. And through them, you learn to cultivate virtues. And through their relationship with you, they cultivate virtues as well because you're both oriented around the mutual pursuit of perfecting human nature, or of the good, as Aristotle would call it. So you learn how to be generous through being around people who are more generous than you, and they might learn how to be patient. Suppose they're not a very patient person, and they develop patience by watching how you exercise patience. Some mutual symmetrical relationship there. And so an idea of what Aristotle is maybe thinking about here, a positive idea, is somebody like Captain America, right? Most of Captain America's conflicts with Tony Stark arise because Captain America doesn't think Tony Stark has many virtues. He's all about his own ego, whereas Captain America is, patriotic and all these sorts of things. He has, even if you've seen the first Avengers movie, where we see how Captain America becomes Captain America, right? I forget the character's name. He's a 90-pound weakling guy, but he has courage, right? He just doesn't have the muscle to back it up until he gets the serum. And the reason they pick him to give him the serum, to turn him into Captain America, is because the serum enhances what's already in the person, right? And so they needed to pick a good person so that would be enhanced rather than a ill-tempered person. Otherwise, they give them the serum, you end up with a bad guy. Right? So there's a book by Mark White that talks about the virtues of Captain America from a virtue ethics standpoint. We could also talk about some negative examples here. In fact, it seems easier to pick out negative examples from an Aristotelian standpoint than to pick out a flourishing individual, although Captain America comes as at least a pretty good fictional example there. But just think of a moral hero, any kind of moral hero that you might have, and what are the character traits that individual has in order to be a moral hero or a moral ideal, and then again, go about cultivating those character traits. Deliberately, that's a very important thing because it has to be through the use of reason, according to Aristotle. And so we could think about human flourishing in this way, right? Think about give a non-moral example here. What would it mean for a plant to flourish, right? If it's the kind of plant that produces flowers, then certainly to grow and reproduce itself. And then to flower is a sign that the plant is flourishing, right? And then a plant needs certain things in order to flourish. Nutrients in the soil, oxygen, right? Sunlight, these sorts of things, right? And without them, that plant definitely will not flourish, and it may wither and die. So there's a non-moral example of what Aristotle has in mind. We can think of this in a moral ways. We need certain character traits in order to flourish as human beings, or we won't achieve happiness either. Again, it's not what happiness means to me. Aristotle has this idea of happiness in terms of excellence of function, right? Defined by the fact that human beings are rational agents, rational beings that we have to cultivate. And then we have a capacity for reason, but we have to cultivate that. And so Aristotle's idea here is about happiness. And so we could look at Rick and Morty here and think about all the characters in the show, really, but in particular, we could think about Rick and Jerry. They have different character flaws from an Aristotelian standpoint, but neither of them is particularly happy individuals. Rick is certainly not happy. And so so what you ought to do here is take a look at the whirly-durly conspiracy episode where Rick takes Jerry out to get him a win because he needs a win bad. In this point of the series, he's divorced and living on his own. That episode starts off with, kind of a depressing scene of him cooking a microwave dinner by himself in a very rundown apartment that he's living in. And so Rick grabs him out of bed just like he did Morty at the very first episode and takes him out to get him a win. Right? And so we could think about, according to Aristotle's ethics, is Jerry likely to achieve human flourishing? And then explain why or why not. Here's a hint. Going the way he's going, he's not going to, right? So what is it what kinds of virtues does Jerry have? But more importantly, what kinds of vices does he have? He's insecure in lots of ways. He's not very accomplished. He's a milquetoast kind of individual. And then likewise with regard to Rick, what kind of vices does he have? Rick has many vices, but one is kind of central to his character. So you want to be able to pick that one out. And it involves intoxication, right? But he also has other character traits. It's certainly the case that Rick possesses some intellectual virtues, for sure, because he knows all the scientific information. He's able to manipulate the material world using technology and scientific principles, right? So he has these intellectual virtues, or at least some of them, right? But he seems to lack moral virtues, right? And so which in particular of those does he lack? And how could he go about cultivating them in order to achieve happiness? It's important to note that Rick seems like a miserable character, right? And at one point, he even attempts suicide. So what kind of character traits feed into that, and what kind of character traits could help him get over that from an Aristotelian standpoint? So be sure and take a look at the whirly-durly conspiracy and think about that episode from an Aristotelian standpoint. So now let's just cover a few criticisms of virtue ethics. First, there are criticisms of the function argument, the idea that human beings have one telos. And in fact, the whole idea of teleological view of human nature comes into conflict with the modern scientific worldview. It has not identified a single telos for human nature, not in Aristotle's sense, certainly, other than a biological one kind of perpetuating your genes, right? So it doesn't look like it has the rich kind of final telos that Aristotle thought human beings did. It's important to note that Aristotle's view of the world was pretty much the view of the world up through the medieval period, but it gets displaced by the modern scientific worldview. And so if you're not only your metaphysics and your entire way of looking at the world is based on this teleological view that conflicts with modern science, it looks like that's going to cut out the legs, the foundations, the metaphysical foundations of Aristotle's approach to ethics. Then from the standpoint of the two other moral theories that we've looked at so far, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, deontology, both of those give us a decision procedure for addressing cases, like hypotheticals like the murderer at the door, or what do I have to do if I have to pick between saving one person and saving the lives of 5 different people. It gives us a decision procedure, right, for answering the question, what ought I do? Well, an objection that's often leveled against virtue ethics, especially from folks in the action, in the act-based moral theory camp, is that virtue ethics doesn't look like it gives us any kind of decision procedure or an action guiding principle for addressing those sorts of cases. And so if you think a moral theory ought to do that, that's the task of a moral theory, then virtue ethics is going to look problematic from that standpoint. It tells us to go be virtuous. Aristotle gives us these rich accounts of the different intellectual and moral virtues, but he doesn't even really give us a criteria for making sharp distinctions between them. Or how many virtues do you have to have in order to flourish, right? That kind of thing. And then there's this last objection called the situationist objection that's based on some social and psychology, social sciences, and both social psychology and personal psychology, that says, especially social psychology, that says it seems to undercut, there are some studies that seem to undercut the idea that human beings have stable character traits of the sort that Aristotle's theory presupposes. The situationist objection says that the way people behave is not based on having stable character traits, but rather things in their social environment that influence how they behave. And so there are these Milgram experiments and obedience studies that show that the social relationships that you're in, the social institutions that you're in, that's really what influences behavior, not having stable character traits of the sort that Aristotle presupposed. So if it's not possible for human beings to really cultivate stable character traits, and that we make an attribution error when we attribute stable character traits to individuals rather than ignore the social circumstances that influence their behavior, then that seems to undercut the idea that we can ever cultivate these habits of character that are front and center in Aristotle's theory. So there's some basic objections to Aristotle's theory as well. So that's a lesson on the basics of Aristotle's virtue ethics. That wraps up the material for this semester. You ought to think about, again, all those points of comparison that I laid out at the beginning between these different moral theories. So are they action-based theories versus character-based theories? Are they teleological theories versus non-teleological theories? Or consequentialist theories versus non-consequentialist theories? Do they have a role for happiness in the theory, or do they not give much of a place for the notion of happiness in the moral theory? So notice that didn't really pop up in Kant's theories at all. And then are they, what do these different theories claim is intrinsically valuable as opposed to instrumentally valuable? So we've seen some differences there as well. So you want to think about all those criteria and all those different aspects of moral theories when you're thinking about comparing each one of these theories with each other. So it'd be a good way to walk through that list and to go through each theory and think about how they, what boxes do they check on with regard to all those different points in order to begin, thinking about how to compare and contrast them. All right, so that's the last of the material for this chapter and the semester. Let me know if you have any questions about it. Feel free to drop me an email or to post your questions in the discussion forums for each of your sections, and I can get back to you that way. We'll also have a live review session here towards the end of the semester for you to ask questions and get some help that way as well. So be sure and shoot me your questions. Certainly do that before you attempt the exams, and I'll see y'all elsewhere online. Y'all take care.